I'm Dr. David Adams. Thank you for joining me for this session in which we'll read some of the Hebrew Bible together. Today we're going to be looking at Jeremiah chapter 33, verses 14 to 16. This is a relatively short passage, so we'll be able to spend a moment at the end talking about the interpretation and application of this passage. But first, let's think a little bit about the context. In the immediately preceding prophecy, Jeremiah had been focused on Jerusalem. This passage stands at the beginning of a different prophecy that's going to focus on the eternal covenant that God had made with David. So, we'll see how this serves to connect those two together. So grab your Hebrew Bible and let's get started. We begin with verse 14. Hine yamim ba'im nu'um Yahweh. The first word out of the gate is a common one for us, the Hebrew particle hine. Most of the time people just translate this with the English gloss, behold. But let's take a moment and think about how this is used in its various ways, because with words like this, these particles, it's often helpful to think about not simply what English word we're going to substitute for the Hebrew word, but to think about the function that this is performing in the context. So what does hine do in Hebrew? Well, the first thing about hine is that it's what one says when one is spoken to. So whenever someone speaks to you, most people would respond by saying something like what or huh. But in Hebrew, that response, in biblical Hebrew at least, that response was hine. Hine is what you said in response to acknowledge the fact that someone has spoken to you. The second thing that hine is used for is that it's commonly an expression of amazement or surprise when something happens unexpected or remarkable, and you want to acknowledge it by saying something like wow or hey. The Hebrew word for that, the biblical Hebrew word for that, is hine again. The third thing that hine is used for is that it's used to emphasize the point that the speaker is making. So this is a rhetorical function. It focuses the attention of the reader or the hearer on what's about to be said or read. And it's kind of the equivalent of the English nota bene, or note well, or pay attention to what I'm about to say here. The fourth thing is that hine is often used to call attention to a situation that the speaker wants to focus on. This is very similar to the previous one, except here I think we're more thinking about actual maybe seeing it or hearing it. And so this is the use that is commonly reflected in the translation behold. In other words, kind of look at this. Another thing that hine is used for is that it's sometimes used to affirm the existence of something. The Hebrew particle yesh functions the same way. Hine is often used with a pronoun or with a participle. Here it's used in this context with the participle ba'im. And in this case, you could still translate it behold, but that's not very indicative of what it's actually doing here. I would translate it with something like, it is the case that, or it is the fact that, and then whatever it is that follows. Another thing that hine is used for is that it's sometimes used to introduce the protasis, the if clause, in a conditional sentence. A conditional sentence has a dependent clause. In English, they usually begin with if, like if X, then Y. The protasis, the if clause, in Hebrew can be introduced by this word hine. So in that case, we would translate it something like if. So which one is being used here? You could make an argument for a couple of them, but I think that I'm inclined to read this with the idea that it affirms a fact that's about to be spoken of. In other words, I would translate this something like it is the case that, or it is a fact that. Yamim ba'im, the days are coming. Nu'um Yahweh. Now here, this phrase, Nu'um Yahweh, technically is a nominal phrase. There's not a verb in it. Nu'um, it is a declaration of Yahweh. We have to supply the verb to be. As you know, it's not normally written in Hebrew in the present tense. Often this phrase is translated as if there was a verb there. And you often see it translated something like declares the Lord. And that's certainly a legitimate translation, although, as I said, Nu'um is actually a noun, and what we have here is a nominal phrase. It is a declaration of Yahweh. So the point is that something that he's talking about is going to take place because God has decreed that it will take place. It is a divine decree. So what is it then that is this divine decree? That's expressed starting in the next clause. V'hakimothi es hadavar hatov. Hakimothi is a hifil from kum. Usually, kum means to arise. In the hifil, we often translate it to establish, to cause something to stand, would be the idea. So I will bring about here. I will establish or perhaps even fulfill in this context es hadavar hatov, the good word. The word here may have a little broader sense of something like promise, because we're talking about God going to be bringing about the word that he has previously spoken, and we'll come back and talk about what that word is at the end of the session. But let's read on. So God says, I will, hakimothi, I will establish, I will bring about the good word, asher divrati es Beth Yisrael wa'al Beth Yehuda. We have a relative clause introduced by asher, the good word which I spoke, and here davar can have perhaps the sense of promise. God, this is something that God said, and now he's going to bring it about. So which I spoke, El Beth Yisrael, Wa'al Beth Yehuda. Notice we have two different prepositions here, El and Al. And this can be a little confusing. One might be inclined to read this something like, which I spoke to the house of Israel and about the house of Judah. But that would be misreading it. Sometimes El and Al overlap with meaning, and they're sometimes used interchangeably. And in each case, you get one used where you might expect the other. So here, simply because of the previous material in the book of Jeremiah, I wouldn't translate it to the house of Israel and about the house of Judah. I think that in the context here, we're talking about God speaking a promise about both of them. So I would read the El as if it were Al. That is to say, I would see the El as overlapping with Al here in this context. So I would translate the word, which I spoke about the house of Israel and the house of Judah. So, just to review this verse, I would take the first part as an affirmation of a fact. It's true that the days are coming. And then this interjection, it is a decree of Yahweh. And the wow in the next clause, since we're talking about coming days, I didn't mention it, but I probably would take that wow on Hakimothi as temporal. The days are coming when I will establish the good word, which in the context means fulfilling the promise that I have spoken concerning the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Let's go on to verse 15. Beyamim hahem, in those days, uba'eth, eighth being the word for time, uba'eth hahi, and in that time. So what is God going to do in those days and at that time? The next clause tells us, well, etzmiach, here this is not all that common a noun. Samak means to sprout or to grow. And here we have the form in the Hifil, etzmiach, with a furtive pathak at the end. So I will cause to grow. And what will he cause to grow? I will cause to grow for David, LeDavid, a tzemak tzedakah. So notice here we have tzemak, the noun. This is the noun that's related to the verb that we had just a couple of words before. So a tzemak is anything that sprouts. It can be foliage in general. It can be an offshoot of some kind. In that sense, it's often translated as branch, but it can just simply mean a sprout or vegetation or a growth, So here, and so we might even translate it a sprout here. I will cause to sprout for David a righteous sprout, a tzedakah tzemak. Now, we have to ask ourselves the question, what is meant by a tzemak tzedakah here? And the answer in the context is an offshoot, that is to say, a descendant of David, that is a tzedakah one. Now, we usually translate this word tzedakah as righteous, and it certainly can mean righteous in the moral sense, but it can also mean something like correct or right, not always in the moral sense. And so in this case, I think what's being said here is that God will bring about what we might in English call a legitimate heir. That is to say, a true heir, one who is in the same spirit, one who carries on the same kind of relationship with God or conducts himself in the same way in terms of the relationship to God as David did. So here, a righteous branch is not very communicative, although it would be a legitimate translation. I would translate it something more like a legitimate heir or something like that for David. So David will bring about, God will bring about for David in the days to come a legitimate successor, legitimate heir or offspring. And what else does the text say about that legitimate offspring? Well, asa mishpat v'tzedakah ba'aretz. Asa, to make or do. So he will make mishpat, justice, and tzedakah, righteousness. So he will do these things. He will do justice and righteousness, or we might in English translate perform justice and righteousness. He will bring them about in the land. So just to put the whole thing together then, in those days and at that time, I will cause to sprout for David a righteous sprout, or a righteous branch, perhaps, really meaning a legitimate heir. He will do justice and righteousness in the land, or he will perform justice and righteousness in the land. Let's turn now to the last verse for today, verse 16. Bayamim hahem tawisha Yehuda. In those days, again, we start off with the temporal prepositional phrase, tiwasha. Here, not really all that difficult. You should be able to parse this one. This is a nifal, imperfect, third feminine singular from yasha. Yasha is a first yod verb that was originally a first wow. And so that wow returns in certain forms. And here in the nifal, you can see that the wow shows up again. And it's a true consonant. So it has a dogish forte in it and also has its own vowel, a comets beneath it. So here, the hirik under the tau, the comets under the first root letter are both characteristic of the nifal. The nifal of the strong verb tikateo has a tsere. Here we have a pathak under the sheen because of the influence of the guttural ayin that follows. So tiwasha, really a pretty straightforward nifal from this first wow verb. So we translate it passive. The verb means to save or help. So in those days, Judah will be saved, or will be helped, but I think saved is probably better here in this context. In those days, Judah will be saved. Well, Yerushalayim tishkon la betach. And Jerusalem will tishkon, will dwell or reside. This word Jerusalem, if you look at it, it may look a little odd to you. Normally, we're accustomed to seeing Jerusalem written this way. Let me zoom in on this so you can see it a little better here. What's the difference between these two? Well, if you look at the way we typically see Jerusalem written, you see it has a yod there. It's a dual-looking form. This is not really a true dual. It's what we call a pseudo-dual, and this kind of formation happens fairly often with place names. We get this mimation or this pseudo-dual form that develops. The form that we have in the text is really the same form. You can see the pathak under the lamed, and you see the hirik written there, but there's no consonant for the hirik. It's kind of written a little bit, you see it's printed off to the right side as you look at it of the main. That's because the yod has dropped out. It doesn't show up in the spelling in this case, but it's pronounced as if the yod were still there. So Yerushalayim is still pronounced the same, even though the yod is not actually written. And this is just something that happens with the place name Jerusalem from time to time. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't signify a difference in meaning. It's just a variant orthography, we would say. It's a different spelling. So, what about Jerusalem? Tishkon labetach, shakan, to dwell or reside. Here's simply a call imperfect. Tishkon, Jerusalem will dwell or reside. La betach, here we have a noun, betach. Noun means safety or security. And the lamed on the front kind of is an adverbial indicator. It indicates we should read this as an adverb in this case. So Jerusalem will dwell in a secure or safe manner. In English, we'd probably just say securely or safely. So Jerusalem will dwell safely. Judah will be saved, and Jerusalem will dwell in safety or in security. Now, let's look at the clause that follows here. Wazeh asher yikrah la Yahweh tzedakenu. The first thing we have to consider is this opening phrase, Zeh asher yikrah la. And the key here is understanding the function of this word zeh. So we need to remind ourselves, what is zeh in Hebrew? Well, zeh is the masculine singular form of the near pronoun, the word for this. This is the near, that is the far pronoun, this. So ze is the masculine singular form of the word this in Hebrew. Just to remind ourselves of the forms here, the feminine singular is zoth, and the plural is common. That is to say, is one form used for both masculine and feminine, and that's the form ele. So ze, masculine, zo, feminine, ele, common, plural to both. So here we're looking at the masculine singular form of the word this. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, to what does this refer? Does it refer to something that's already been mentioned, or something that is getting ready to be mentioned? Because it can be either. Most of the time, ze will be used to refer to something that's already been mentioned. So let's look at the possibilities. The most obvious possibility, because it's the closest in terms of position, is the word Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, that we were just talking about a moment ago. Now, I mentioned Jerusalem is looks dual in form. It's not a true dual. As the name of a city, it is normally treated as a feminine noun. And that's the way it's treated here also. If we look at the verb form, tishkon, it's third feminine singular, and later on, Jerusalem is picked up with the pronoun attached to the preposition lamed, la, also feminine. So here, Jerusalem, normally feminine and clearly referred to as feminine in this case. So it's unlikely, it's not impossible, but it's unlikely that ze would refer to Jerusalem in this case. So the other possibility would be Judah, Yehuda. Now Judah looks feminine because of the ending, but in fact, as the name of a region or a country or an area, Judah is normally treated in Hebrew as a masculine noun. But here's the oddity. In this case, look at the verb that's associated with it, tewashah. Nifal, we said, third feminine singular. So even though Judah is normally treated as a masculine noun, here in this context, it's being treated as a feminine noun. So it's possible that ze could refer to Judah, but because in Hebrew, sometimes it happens that you get a noun that is treated as masculine or feminine. We really should call them common because they really have both genders or neither gender. It's used either way, depending on, frankly, the way the Spirit moves the author at the time, I think. But in any case, here the author seems to have in mind treating this as a feminine noun. And so while it's certainly possible that ze could refer to Judah, I think it's less likely that it does. So the other possibility then, if it's not Judah and it's not Jerusalem, the other possibility is that represented by the asher that follows it. Now, asher is an indeclinable relative. That is to say, another way of saying it's common. It doesn't have separate forms for masculine and feminine. But the point here is that ze would be used at the front of this clause as the subject of a nominal sentence. So we would translate something like, this is that which, or this is what will be called to her, to finish out the rest of this phrase. Yikra is third masculine singular, but there is, there's no definite subject expressed in the context. This is indefinite. So as in many languages, not just Hebrew, verbs with an indefinite subject are often an alternate way of expressing the idea of the passive voice. So literally, we might translate, if we were being very wooden, this is what one calls to her. But most of the time, we would translate this as a passive and say, this is what she will be called. And then the what is it that she will be called is expressed by the rest of this phrase. Another nominal sentence, Yahweh Tzedekenu, Yahweh is our righteousness. This phrase, kara followed by lamed, is an idiom in Hebrew for giving a name to something. To call to it is an idiomatic way of saying to name it. And so we might translate this, she will be called Yahweh is our righteousness. So just to wrap up here, this last verse, in those days Judah will be saved and Jerusalem will dwell securely. And here I'd maybe translate it something like, this is what she will be called, or this is what she will be named. Yahweh is our righteousness. So that wraps up the translation. We have a little bit of a shorter text this week. But before we leave, I'd like to say a little bit about the interpretation of this passage. I mentioned at the outset that this text follows one which focuses on Jerusalem. And so there are really two things that we ought to pay attention to as we interpret this text. The first thing we need to recognize is that this passage is very similar to another passage in Jeremiah, chapter 23, 10 chapters back, verses 5 and 6. By the way, this is just the ESV's translation. So let's walk through this and compare it with what we have here in chapter 33. So in chapter 23, verse 5, we have this. In chapter 33, I translated, it is true that the days are coming. It is a decree of Yahweh when I will establish the good word. Notice, despite the differences in the way the ESV translates it and the way that I translated it here, these are exactly the same words in Hebrew. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up. Here also they've also taken the wow on the form Wahakimothi in a temporal way, and they translate it raise up rather than establish. Behold, the days are coming when I will establish. And then the next clause, for David a righteous branch. And notice that in Jeremiah 33, now the object of this is different. In chapter 33, God says he will establish the good word that he spoke concerning the house of Israel and the house of Judah. In other words, he's going to fulfill the promise that he has given. And I'm pretty sure that here in chapter 33, the good word that he spoke is this passage back in chapter 23. I don't think it's accidental that the two are so similar. And here, the part of the difference in this case is that he's referring specifically back to the text in chapter 23 that was already recorded. So, moving on then, in those days and at that time, I will cause to sprout for David a righteous sprout. So, righteous branch, the ESV translated righteous sprout, same words in Hebrew. And then our text continues, he will do justice and righteousness in the land, and that phrase also occurs the same way in chapter 23. But in chapter 23, we have another clause stuck in between. He will reign as king and deal wisely. So, here, this is a significant departure, and its significance is that it focuses chapter 23 much more on the king, on David, whereas chapter 33, as we'll see, has a different focus. So let's walk through these again. The next verse, in Deuteronomy 23, verse 6, it begins, in his days. Jeremiah 33:16, in those days. So again, notice the contrast between his and those. The focus is more on the person in chapter 23. Continues, Judah will be saved and Israel will dwell securely. Chapter 33 Judah will be saved, and Jerusalem will dwell securely. Notice chapter 33 has Israel, chapter 23 has Israel, chapter 33 has Jerusalem. Now, interestingly, the Septuagint has an alternate reading and reads Jerusalem in chapter 23. It's impossible to be certain whether Jerusalem or Israel is the correct reading there. It is clear, however, that Jerusalem is the correct reading in chapter 33. There's no variant, but also, as we'll see, it fits better. The phrase, they will dwell securely, is the same, except that in chapter 23, it's masculine because the word Israel is masculine in Hebrew. In chapter 33, it's feminine because the city named Jerusalem is feminine in Hebrew. So this is not simply an accidental substitution of Israel and Jerusalem. It's not just a slip on the part of a copyist. This is an intentional difference here, and we can see that intentionality not only in the fact that the verb is feminine or masculine, depending on the noun, but also notice how at the beginning the shift is indicated further by the fact that we have his days, talking about the person in chapter 23, and in those days, because we're not talking about the person in chapter 33. Lastly, in chapter 23, the phrase is, this is the name by which he will be called. It will be said of him, again, masculine because Israel is masculine. In chapter 33, we didn't point it out, but the word was la there, preposition lamed plus feminine suffix. She will be called because Jerusalem, again, is feminine. So the name in chapter 23 is the same as the name in 33, but in chapter 23 it's applied to the person of the king, the descendant of David. In chapter 33, it's applied to the city of Jerusalem. So this passage is very similar, but notice the difference in details that we called your attention to. They add up because there's a different focus between the two. In Jeremiah 23, the focus is on the king, the righteous descendant or legitimate heir or legitimate successor of David. In chapter 33, the focus is on Jerusalem. I mentioned the fact that the preceding oracle in Jeremiah 33 is all about the city of Jerusalem. And the following oracle is about the king, actually about the promise that God made to David that there would be a coming king. So on the perpetual promise that God made to David. So our passage here serves as a bridge to connect the promises to Jerusalem with the promises that God made to David of an heir and successor. And so the Jeremiah, or Baruch perhaps, is repositioning this promise and applying it not just to the heir, but to the significance of the heir, the significance of the coming king for the city. And he does this because he's putting it here to bridge, to emphasize how the fulfillment of this prophecy bridges the future hope of Jerusalem, or centers that future hope of Jerusalem in the person of the promised successor to David. So that's one thing to note. By reading the text carefully and attending to the details, we can see how the focus of this text is different from that very similar passage in chapter 23. So, the second thing that we want to note about this passage is that this is one of a number of passages in the Old Testament where Jerusalem is given an eschatological name. That is, in the age to come, Jerusalem will be given a new name. And let's just take a quick look at some of those names in the Old Testament. In Isaiah chapter 1, verse 26, we read that in the age to come, Jerusalem will be called the city of righteousness and the faithful town. In Isaiah 62, the city will be named, My delight is in her. In Jeremiah 3, earlier in the book of Jeremiah, in the age to come, Jerusalem will have the name, the throne of Yahweh. Here in Jeremiah 33, Yahweh is our righteousness. In Ezekiel chapter 48, we get the name of the eschatological city, Yahweh is there, kind of highlighting the presence of God in the eschatological city. And finally, in Zechariah chapter 8, the eschatological name of the city of Jerusalem will be the faithful city, much like that of Isaiah 126, and the mountain of Yahweh Sabaoth, or the holy mountain. This one's a little more like Jeremiah 3, the throne from which Yahweh will rule, because back in Exodus 15, Yahweh will rule from the mountain that he's going to establish as his abode. So the notion of kingship is connected here to the idea of the holy mountain from which God will rule over creation. Now, I mention these eschatological names because I think this would make a really interesting sermon series, or perhaps a Bible study series, looking at the names that Jerusalem will have in the age to come. And they all tell us something a little bit about what God is doing. So in Isaiah 1:26, Jerusalem will be the city of righteousness, the faithful town. It will no longer wander into sin, into disobedience, but be true and faithful to God. Isaiah 62, my delight is in her, highlighting the fact that Jerusalem will become what God says of his people in Exodus 19, that they will be his most prized possession. In Jeremiah 3, the throne of Yahweh, I already mentioned this highlights the rule of God over creation. Jerusalem will be the throne from which God will rule over his kingdom. Yahweh is our righteousness, here in Jeremiah 33, highlights the fact that Jerusalem will not be the city of righteousness because of its own righteousness, but rather it will be this righteous city, the faithful town, because of God's righteousness and what he brings to them and what he gives them in Christ. Ezekiel 48, Yahweh is there, highlights the presence of God in the eschatological city. God himself will be the temple. We see this connecting very much to the book of Revelation in the New Testament. And finally, Zechariah 8. Here, because we've already had the faithful city back in Isaiah 1, I'd probably highlight, I think maybe in Isaiah 1, I'd highlight the city of righteousness, and here I'd highlight the faithful city part if I were doing a sermon series or a Bible study series on these, and kind of bring all of it together here, that Jerusalem is righteous because God has made them righteous. This is the place where he dwells and the place from which he will rule over his eschatological kingdom. So I think this is a very interesting theological passage and would be part of an interesting sermon series or Bible study, a short Bible study series, if you'd like to take it up, on the eschatological names of the city of Jerusalem. But in any case, thank you for joining me. I'm Dr. David Adams, and we've been looking at Jeremiah chapter 33, verses 14 to 16.